Okay, right. Good morning, friends. Let me welcome you to this monthly talk of the Rail Enthusiast Society. Speaker today is our secretary, Mr. L Singh. I think he doesn't require any introduction. He is the sort of driving force behind our society. He edits our magazine. He is a railwayman of over half a century, and he joined the Indian Railway Service of Mechanical Engineers. He served for a long time on the Indian Railways, then worked with Rights and has worked in many parts of the world, including Vietnam, parts of Africa, and so on. The subject that he will be speaking on today is the Territorial Army. The Territorial Army, just for those of you who are not familiar, the Territorial Army is a sort of second line of defense for the Indian Army. There are a number of units of the Territorial Army, but there were a few units which were dedicated exclusively for the railways, which were manned by railwaymen and officered by railway officers. When we joined the railways, a great effort was made by management to persuade us to join the Territorial Army, and some of us eventually did join. Every year there used to be a camp because individuals joined different units spread out all over the country, and once a year there used to be a month-long camp where these officers and men were trained in sort of details regarding being a soldier and being an officer and being a part of the army. The Territorial Army railway units did play a very important part. I mean, I joined the railways in 1971, and in the 1971 war, they distinguished themselves in the western sector against Pakistan, where they manned the railway line which goes to Hyderabad, Sindh, and the sort of transition boundary station is Munabao. And in that area, there was some very heavy fighting. There were napalm bombs dropped on various trains, and a number of gallantry awards were given to the Territorial Army units. And I'm sure GL will talk about that. In addition to that, I do recall in 1974, when there was a very major strike on Indian Railways, the Territorial Army did play a role in managing and running some trains in various parts of the country, although the strike was successful. But skeleton services were run all over the country by the Territorial Army. And I think it should be a very interesting talk because unfortunately what has happened, maybe 2 decades back, the Territorial Army railway units were disbanded. Why that was done? Perhaps as a measure of economy. Now that I see the war going on between Russia and Ukraine, if you would have noticed that the Russian army moves primarily by rail. Most of the troops that have come from various parts of Russia to the Ukrainian border or coming up to the border, because at the border they have actually cut the railway lines, is by rail. The railway still maintains a fleet of military wagons, but they have unfortunately disbanded the Territorial Army units, which to my mind seemed a little disappointing because they have played a major role in the wars in the past. With this introduction, I hand you over to L Singh for this very interesting talk, which I'm looking forward to. JL, all yours.
Thank you, Veenu. I would like to start with a disclaimer. What I will be telling you about today is the Territorial Army as it was about 25 to 30 years back. I did serve almost 2 decades with the Territorial Army, but I left the Territorial Army in 1990, which means the bulk of the information that I have is now about 25 to 30 years old. Of course, I have updated some of the information, but if anybody finds the slight lacunae in what I'm going to say, please excuse me because I'm speaking mostly from memory. I will tell you about what the Territorial Army is, how it functions, and also my personal experiences in the Territorial Army. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yeah.
We will talk about this picture later because it will form part of my presentation. So I will start by telling you that what the Territorial Army is, and then my own personal experiences while I served with it. The first thing, the Territorial Army is not limited to the railways. In fact, the army outside the railways is far larger. It is basically a volunteer force, a second line of defense, as Binu mentioned, for people who are employed. You cannot join the Territorial Army as a job. That you have to join the regular army. The Territorial Army is meant for people who are already employed or who are self-employed. In fact, one of the requirements of the Territorial Army is that if you join it, you have to give an undertaking if you are self-employed that you will join a camp every year and you will join the army whenever you are required to do so. If you are employed, then your employer has to give such an undertaking. As far as the railways go, the railway administration has given the undertaking that any person who has joined the Territorial Army will be released as and when required. For non-railway Territorial Armies, you're required to join a camp 2 months a year. I believe in some cases it was even 3 months, but normally it is 2 months. The remaining 10 months you do your normal work, and for 2 months you join an army camp to learn the army trade as well as the work that you are doing. What is the role of the TA? It is to bear arms in times of national defense, to help whenever there's a national emergency. The bulk of the TA units are infantry units. This picture on the left, on the right, is one of the Territorial Army units that is part of the 6th Regiment of the Regular Army. Every TA unit is joined to one of the Regular Army units. The railway TA units are what are departmental TA units. That means they come from a department. For example, since we came from the railways, we did not have to learn the railway trade. We only had to learn how to fit in with the army and how to use weapons and so on. There are other departmental TAs also, like telecommunications, refineries and pipelines, ONGC, hospitals. There used to be a postal TA also, but that has been disbanded completely. You mentioned that the railway TA units were disbanded. They were not disbanded completely, but they were only reduced in size. Now, let us talk specifically about the railway TA. As I mentioned earlier, it is a departmental TA, which means we do our normal railway jobs for 11 months of the year. And for 1 month, departmental TAs go to camp for only 1 month. 1 month we join an army camp, learn the army way of life, don the army uniform, and we are complete soldiers for that 1 month. We will also be complete soldiers as and when we are called upon during an emergency or during war. The railway TA units don the uniform and insignia of the Corps of Engineers of the Indian Army. In fact, once you are in uniform, there is no way of telling whether you are a regular army person or whether you are TA. It is not that you had railway TA units right in the beginning. Initially, the Corps of Engineers of the regular army had railway battalions by itself. What this meant was that the battalion was taught railway trades, and as and when required, they worked trains. A better option was that instead of training regular army men to work as railwaymen, you trained railwaymen in the army way of life, and as and when required, they would leave their normal railway job, come into the army, and do the work there. So this is what was done. Railway TA units were first raised as an auxiliary force through the Territorial Army Act of 1948. The objective, as I have recorded here, was to maintain rail communications in forward areas during active hostilities and to carry on essential rail transportation in an emergency in peacetime. By the 1970s, especially after the Chinese war and the war we had with Pakistan in 1975, there were 10 railway tier units. Since the railway tier units did a very good job during the 1974 general strike of the railways, these tier units were raised to 15. Today, out of these 15, 9 tier units have been disbanded, and we have only 6 tier units today, which is a pity, because if there is a war again, or if there is a major emergency again, we may not require 15, but will certainly require 10 units. The existing units today are listed here. There is one at Jamalpur, one at Jhansi, one at Kota, one at Adra, one at Chandigarh, and one at Hyderabad. That means the permanent establishment of these tier units are at these locations. I would like to mention here that earlier, all the tier units, the 10 tier units that were there, were paid for by the army. The army paid all the allowances and the salaries, etc., when you were embodied, and also during that 1 month camp that you had. After the time when the railways raised 5 more units, these 5 units were paid for by the railways. The original 10 were paid for by the army, and these 5 were paid by the railways. But today, all the 6 existing units are paid for by the railways. I think the main reason why the tier units were disbanded was economy. But I only hope that the requirement to have them is not there again. Now, what was one tier unit? One tier unit comprised of around 1,400 men. Of these 1,400, there were about 100 regular army personnel, and the rest were all railwaymen. The railwaymen did their normal job for 11 months, and once a year for 1 month, they attended a TA camp at their headquarters. Like I was in the Ajmer tier unit, so our camp used to be normally near or in Ajmer. So once, 1 month in a year, I was called upon, did the TA camp and came back. Of course, in case there was war or some national emergency, then you could be called upon. The word used was you could be embodied to serve in the TA and do the job of an army man. This unit of 1,400 men was headed by a lieutenant colonel then. Today, I understand it is headed by a full colonel, not a lieutenant colonel. The commanding officer was always a railwayman. The second in command was a major who was also a railwayman. The person third in line was a regular major from the army, who was the administrative officer of the unit. Each of these units was divided into 4 companies, each company headed by a major who was normally a railwayman. Out of these 4 companies, 2 were operating companies. That means they actually ran trains. One was a workshop company, which was for the maintenance of rolling stock. And the third was a civil engineers company, which maintained the track and kept the track operational for the operating companies. As I mentioned earlier, each company was headed by a railwayman who was a major. His second in command was normally a regular army person who was a captain. Now, what was the task of each unit? Each unit was supposed to look after 200 kilometers of track. On that, they had staff and provided for looking after 2 terminal stations and 6 intermediate stations. Their job was to run 8 trains either way on this 200 kilometers track. The railway staff did not require any training to do railway work. They were all trained serving railwaymen, so they did the railway work. The regular army, 100 odd who were there on a permanent basis, they organized the logistics, like the food and the supplies and the ammunition and the arms and so on. And when you were not embodied or when you were not in a camp, they kept custody of all the weapons, they kept custody of all the stores, and they kept a record of what the regiment was to do at that time. Now, let me tell you something about my own personal experiences in the TA. Unfortunately, the first time that I learned of the TA, was when we had the war against Pakistan in 1971. I was then a probationary officer on the railways. When it was imminent that war is going to take place, sometime in the middle of 71, I volunteered to join the Territorial Army. I was told that probationers were not taken into the army. So I could not join the TA before the war. But the unit that I joined later, the 1033 Railway Engineers, which was based at Ajmer, was the unit that took a very active part in this war. So from the veterans who had taken part in the war, I learned a lot about the war itself. So I will tell you something about what this unit did during the 71 war against Pakistan. The 1033 Railway Engineers were embodied to work on the Barmer sector. I've drawn a small map here. That black line you see across, that is the border between Pakistan and India. From Ajmer to Hyderabad, Sindh in Pakistan is almost a straight line. You'll find the line goes through Jodhpur, it goes through Barmer, it goes to Munabao. Munabao was the last station on the Indian side of the border, and the first station on the Pakistani side was Pokhrapar. Pokhrapar is roughly 10 kilometers from the border. Then via Mirpur, Khas and Niachor, the line goes to Hyderabad, and from there it goes towards Karachi. In fact, this was the line where the famous Sindh mail used to run between Bombay and Karachi before independence. The train started from Bombay, came via Ahmedabad, Palanpur. It did not touch Jodhpur. It came to Marwar, Luni, Barmer, Munabao, Mirpur Khas, Hyderabad, Karachi. Of course, the Hyderabad to Marwar line, in fact, up to Palanpur was meter gauge. So you started broad gauge from Bombay, came to Ahmedabad, changed to meter gauge, went meter gauge all the way to Hyderabad, and from Hyderabad to Karachi, you were broad gauge again. In fact, the interesting fact is that this line between Jodhpur and Hyderabad, when it was first built, on the what is now mostly in Pakistan, was built as a broad gauge line, and the one on the Indian side was built as a meter gauge line. But because of lack of too much traffic on this, the Hyderabad line was also converted to meter gauge. So when we became independent, it was a meter gauge line from Jodhpur to Hyderabad. Later on, I think 2003, we converted the line to broad gauge. And by 2006, Pakistan had also converted this line to broad gauge. So it became a fully broad gauge line. And from 2006 to 2019, you had a train called the Thar Express, which ran between Jodhpur and Hyderabad. This train was stopped in 2019 and does not run nowadays. Anyway, this was the line on which the 1033 Railway Engineers was embodied to work during the war. You can judge the kind of area this was, because as soon as they arrived at Munabao, this was the sign that they saw. Welcome to the land of 5 S's: sand, sandstorms, sand dunes, snakes, and scorpions. This is the kind of terrain that they had to work in. There was no good road in this area. When the 1033 Railway Engineers reached Munabao, the Indian Army had already advanced about 30 to 40 kilometers inside Pakistan. They had to be supplied. Logistics was a major problem. Army trucks were getting bogged down in the sand and could not supply. So it became imperative that the supplies were made by rail. So the main task assigned to this unit was to transport water, ammunition, rations, and other stores to the front. Now the front wasn't a fixed point. It could vary depending on day to day. And as I mentioned earlier, the Indian Army had already advanced about 40 kilometers into Pakistan when trains started operations. It was planned to run bulk of the trains at night because daytime there was always the danger of being strafed. The first task was to link the line between the Indian side and the Pakistani side. The gap was about 15 to 20 kilometers. Fortunately, the railways are very good at this. Even on normal accidents, suppose there's an accident, they will lay a bypass line in no time at all. So all these spare prefabricated track was taken from all over Northern Railway and Western Railway, and within a day, the two tracks were linked. The unit was moved to Pokhrapar in Pakistan as I mentioned, that was about 10 kilometers inside the border. And the first train carrying mostly water, ammunition, and provisions ran on the same day. Now, since you didn't know where the front line was, it's not that you went to a station and unloaded. Wherever the front line was, short of that, you stopped and you unloaded. And on the return journey, this train was stripped. The driver of this train was a gentleman called Durga Shankar. The driver is what you would call a loco pilot today. I'm told that this train was bombed. He was severely injured and he worked the train with his elbows and brought it back safe. By the time the war ended, the Indian Army had advanced as far as the place called Naya Chor, which is only about 20 kilometers short of Hyderabad Sindh. I mean, if the war had carried on a little longer, perhaps the Indian Army would have even gone as far as Sindh. This is a picture taken by one of the members of the 1033 engineers when they were working on connecting the track between India and Pakistan. On 14/12/22, the train that was coming back from after delivering the goods, 4 wagons derailed. So you have to derail that. So the derailing work was carrying on during the day. Sometime in the afternoon, 4 starfighters were returning from a bombing raid in India. They spotted this train. Luckily, the number of bombs they had were very few. Otherwise, this train would have been totally bomb overflow. But they stripped the train with bullets. Lieutenant Colonel M.L. Khanna, who was then a Deputy Chief Mechanical Engineer on Western Railway, he was the commanding officer of the unit. This picture, which I am showing you on the right, I got from him directly. Apparently, it was taken while hiding under a wagon and bombs were being dropped around them. He says that when one of these strafing runs that this plane had, the bullets must have been about 10 feet away from them. I mean, if that plane had been slightly 10 feet to one side, they would have all been killed. Of course, one thing that did save them was the availability of an anti-aircraft gun, which was loaded on a flat wagon. This is a picture of the anti-aircraft gun on the wagon. Those were the days when you didn't have missiles. You actually had anti-aircraft guns, and you sort of laid a carpet of bombs in the area, and the plane had to dodge all of them. This is a picture of some members of the 1033 engineers at a Pakistani station called Basarba. Those of you who were on the railways might recognize Lieutenant Colonel Khanna and N.C. Sinha. Mr. Khanna is there's one civilian person in the middle. To his right is M.L. Khanna and to his left is N.C. Sinha. I'll be telling you more about both of them a little later. The unit kept running trains even after hostilities ended and as long as India stayed in that part of Pakistan. It was only after the Shimla Agreement, etc., that we withdrew and we stopped running trains in that area. For the good work that the unit has done, they were given 6 awards: 1 Veer Chakra, 2 Vishisht Seva medals, and 3 mention in dispatches. Veer Chakra and mention in dispatches are gallantry awards in the face of the enemy. Vishisht Seva medals are for good work, but not necessarily in the face of the enemy. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel M.L. Khanna, he was awarded a Vishisht Seva medal or a VSM. There you see a picture of him receiving the medal from Field Marshal Manekshaw, then General Manekshaw, Chief of the Army Staff. This was the letter that the Railway Board sent to Western Railway, addressed to Mr. M.L. Khanna, and a copy of this letter was placed on the service record of every person of the 1033 Railway engineers, commending the good work that they had done. I don't know if you can read this letter, but basically they are being commended for the good work that was done. Driver Durga Shankar was awarded the Veer Chakra for being able to work the train back to safety in spite of being wounded himself and without worrying about his own personal safety. He could have easily left the train and run away, but he didn't. He brought the train back. N.C. Sinha, who finally retired as General Manager of South Central Railway, was a lieutenant then. he was given a mention in dispatches. What I'm told is that the unit was at Pokhara Power Station and the Pakistanis had raided the station, and a train that was standing there, the front portion of the train had caught fire. Luckily, the front portion only had non-ammunition stores like tents and food and so on. The last few wagons were all carrying ammunition. And if the fire had reached these wagons, they would have been hell to pay. Mr. N.C. Sinha noted this, and along with another army soldier, they hand-shunted these wagons away from the main train without worrying about their personal danger. Because if the fire had gotten to these ammunition wagons, he would have certainly been killed. So for this act, he was given a mention in dispatches. Then there were three other gentlemen, one Vishis Seva medal and two mentioned in dispatches. They were all involved in linking the Indian side of the track to the Pakistani side and then working, keeping the track running. Particularly the initial part, when they had gone onto the track for the first time, there was the danger. The track may have been damaged, it might have been mined, but they went through, made sure that the track was okay so that our trains could run. Captain Janardhan, who was an executive engineer on the Western Railway at that time, got a VSM, and two gentlemen, one an assistant engineer and one a permanent way inspector, were awarded mention in dispatches. So this was the kind of work that the 1033 railway engineers did. There were other units working in different areas. There were a number of TA units that worked in what became Bangladesh. But none of these units were actually in the line of fire. They did a lot of good work without being strafed and bombed the way the 1033 railway engineers was. I will now come to the 1974 strike, which was another very major event where the Territorial Army took part. By this time, I had joined the Territorial Army, and I was part of the unit when it got embodied for the 74 strike. See, the 1974 strike was perhaps the last major strike on the Indian Railways. After that, there have been strikes, but they have all been localized and local strikes in local areas. A strike covering the entire Indian Railways, the last one was in 1974. There were various issues, we will not go into that now. The strike was led by George Fernandez, who was Bombay-based. He was the trade union leader at that time. So when the strike became imminent, towards the end of April, all TA units were embodied, placed at various locations with the intention of keeping trains running so that psychologically it would appear that the strike has failed and trains are still running. 1033 railway engineers were posted at Bhusawal division of Central Railway. No TA unit was posted on its own railway. They were posted on a different railway. Because ours was a Western Railway unit. So we were not posted on Western Railway. We were posted on Central Railway. The strike started on the 8th of May, 1974. It had been expected that Bhusawal division would be badly hit by the strike, but it wasn't. When the strike started, yes, there were some people who went on strike even on Bhusawal division, but by and large, the division kept running. However, Bombay division, which was the stronghold of George Fernandez, was on total strike, with more than 90% staff not working. So we were ordered immediately. Overnight, we were moved to Bombay division. And our job was to run trains between Bombay and Igatpuri. We kept the main unit at Bombay, who ran trains from Bombay to Kasara, which is at the foot of the ghats that go from Kasara to Igatpuri. For those who, like Paul, who may not be familiar with the word ghat, in railway parlance, ghat basically means a very steep grade where you have special working rooms. On this 11-12 kilometers between Kasara and Igatpuri, the ruling grade is 1 in 37. So it's a very steep grade and you required special working rules to work there. So we had the main unit in Bombay running from trains from CSM, what is today CSMT, to Kasara. And we had a small unit at Igatpuri to run trains on this ghat section. I was placed along with the unit at Igatpuri. So I've come to the next embodiment. Now, Although there is staff on the TA unit for all operational and maintenance purposes, the main requirement during any embodiment or strikes is of running staff, primarily drivers. So in spite of the fact that we were running only about 8 trains per day on that section, we ultimately ran short of drivers. One more reason for that was that in the early 70s, a lot of our staff was still steam oriented. We had steam drivers who would be of no use during a strike. To make matters worse, the Igatpuri to Bombay section was electrified, whereas almost all the drivers we had were only diesel trains. They were not electric trains. They could not work electric trains. Therefore, since we had only diesel drivers, we decided to run with diesels from Itarsi on this section. Now, we found there were no staff available in Igatpuri who could tell us about the special working rules of the Ghat section. We had one inspector, if I remember right, who was available, who knew this section and who was an electric inspector, electric robo inspector. So we first ran light engines up and down the Ghat along with this inspector to teach the drivers the road. See, normally a person like, say, me, who knows how to handle a diesel locomotive, I could easily handle a train, but I'm not allowed for 2 reasons. One, my eyesight is not approved for the eyesight requirements of a driver. Although I may have that eyesight, but I'm not certified for it. Second, I don't know the road. Road means I should know from where to spot signals. I should know where the grades are. I should know where the, what type of loops each station has. That is knowing the road. So before a driver actually works a section, he is given a number of trips on that section, up and down, day and night, so that he knows the road. Of course, since we were in the T and we were in emergency, we didn't follow the route to the hill, but we sent our drivers up and down the Ghat so that they learned how to run the road. So we began running trains. But since we were running diesel trains and not electrics, we broke up the freight goods train that we had into half to 1/3 and ran with only much fewer wagons than we would normally do it. On the 3rd or 4th day, we ran out of drivers. I had been traveling with the drivers up and down the Ghat, so theoretically I knew the road. So I decided to take one load myself. So I remember the exact date, but I was on the locomotive as the driver. I had a regular TA assistant with me. I decided that I will not allow the speed to go above 25 to 30 kilometers per hour at any stage, and we would go down the Ghat. So we left Igatpuri, and it was like looking down into a well. I mean, it looked so steep down, going down. I put on my dynamic brakes full, and we began rolling down, and I was feeling quite comfortable that we are going at about 25 to 30 kilometers per hour. At this time, the assistant asked me to look at the speedometer. I looked at the speedometer and the train, and the speed was 45 kilometers per hour. I didn't realize we were going so fast. Now, on this section, I don't know the situation today, but then you had 3 catch sidings. A catch siding is provided on steep downgrades, so that in case you are a runaway train, you are forced to go into that catch siding, which is a very steep upgrade, so that instead of going down the main line and maybe riding with another train, you go up the catch siding and you are captured there and you stop there. The rule was that normally the line would be set for the catch siding. You have to stop at the catch siding. Then the cabin at the catch siding would set the point for the main line and you would go down. Now, you were moving at about 40-45 kilometers per hour. My dynamic brakes were fully on, and I could see the signal of the catch siding not too far away. Gentlemen, I can assure you, perhaps for the first time in my life, I realized what fear was. I put every brake the locomotive had, I put that on. And the train just didn't seem to be slowing down, and that signal was approaching closer and closer. Then you know what real fear is. Fortunately, since we did not have a complete load and we only had 1/3 of the load, we finally came to a halt, I would say 2 or 3 meters from the point that took you into the catch siding. Since cabin staff was all on strike, we had to go ourselves, change the point, go down. Because after that, I was careful and we kept the train under control. And we reached Kasara without further excitement or mishap. But it was a very interesting experience. After that, I worked 2 more trains down the Ghat and of course 2 up the Ghat also. And that's what experience is. I was able to go down without any difficulty. The strike was called off after 20 days. We remained there for another 15 days or so, and then we came back. But the job that was assigned to us, keep trains running. So that psychologically the impression was given that yes, trains are still running. That purpose was served. It was after the strike and the good work that the railway tier units had done to help controlling the strike, that the railways raised 5 more units, 5 more tier units, which were all paid for by the railways. I think over the years, since we didn't have any more strikes and we haven't had any major war either, that the army and the railways between them have decided to disband more than half of the units. The next embodiment that I went on was in 1979 on the North Frontier Railway. See, those days, there were a lot of wildcat strikes and other problems on NF Railway. Trains were being stopped all over the place. Drivers were not coming on duty, and they were having all kinds of problems. So, tier units were embodied to help the rail administration to keep trains running. So, our unit was embodied on NF Railway, and we were stationed at Siliguri. And our main job was to keep that section between New Jalpaiguri and New Bongaigaon, which was then a broad gauge section. And the broad gauge went only as far as New Bongaigaon to keep that operational. There was another unit, not from the Western Railway. I think it was the Adra unit, which was beyond Guwahati, and they worked trains beyond Guwahati on the Lumding area. We must have been embodied for about, I think it was 5.5 months. And our main task was that whenever there was a requirement, trains were stranded or some sections were blocked, we went over and cleared those sections and helped the NF Railway administration. Again, the main requirement was that of drivers. I come to a very specific incident which happened while we were embodied there. The commanding officer unit was then a gentleman called P.S. Chaudhary, who finally retired as a member of the railway board. He was a lieutenant colonel of the unit. I was along with him when we happened to be in New Bongaigaon. And it was found that there were 2 rakes lying in the Bongaigaon yard and only 1 locomotive to clear the yard. All lines on the yard were blocked. That means there were trains on them and no other train could be received. P.S. Chaudhary gave the suggestion that we join 2 rakes together and clear it with 1 locomotive so that 2 lines become vacant. This is quite a common practice in the railways then. It was resorted to in the railways. It is now common practice now. It was resorted to even then, but not too often. Since almost all the rakes that came into New Bongaigaon were loaded and the ones that left were empty, it was not difficult joining 2 rakes together. The load would not be very much. So it was decided that 2 rakes would be joined together. With 1 locomotive, we would clear it up to New Jalpaiguri. There was a slot available. If you left at about 10 at night, you would not be hitting any passenger train. This was important because it was a single line section and you could not arrange any crossing to the train like this. The arrangement was that we would have a TA driver on the train and the guard would be from the NF Railway. At about 10, it was found that the guard of NF Railway had not come and he was nowhere in sight. The yardmaster said that if you don't start in about 5 or 10 minutes, you would lose that slot we had of running the train up to New Jalpaiguri. P.S. Chaudhary came with the solution. He told the driver that you go back to the guard. And he told me, L Singh, you're the driver, please drive the train. So I found I was the driver on the train. The yardmaster asked P.S. Chaudhary, this is not a normal train, what should we call it? He said, let's call it a Python. We call it Python 1. Now, I do not know if this is the first time that the word Python was formally used for a long train in India. As far as I know, it was perhaps the first time. If anybody is aware of a train being called a Python before 1979, please let me know. Otherwise, I can claim that the first formal Python on the Indian Railway was run by me. Anyway, I got onto the train. We had a regular assistant with me, and P.S. Chaudhary also decided to travel on the locomotive. We signaled. We looked back. The train was very long. It was misty. The line was on a slight curve. You couldn't see the guard signal that things were okay. But we assumed that he must have reached the brakeman, and the train started. We got full run-through green signals everywhere, going along merrily. We suddenly found a red signal at New Cooch Behar. At New Cooch Behar station, for some reason, we had not got a green signal, and we got a signal. So I braked. By this time, I was fairly experienced, so I knew that immediately nothing happens. And after some time, the train will start slowing down. But even after some time, the train didn't stop slowing down. So I applied emergency brakes. The train was still not slowing down. And I could see the signal approaching closer and closer. The train finally began slowing down, but it was obvious we would go past the signal. Luckily, this was fourth quadrant signaling, where the facing points are not immediately after the home signal, but about 120 meters away. And it was obvious that the rate at which we were slowing down, that we would go past the signal, but we would stop before the facing points. P.S. Chaudhary gave me interesting advice. He says, please switch off the headlight. I said, why? Then the station master can't make out that you have gone past signals. So this was possible then because there was no track circuiting. But today, most of the main stations, the big stations are track circuited. So this ploy won't work. He said, even put off your cab lights. That way, the station master has no way of knowing that you have gone past signals. Anyway, we went about past the signal, and we must have stopped about halfway between the signal and the facing point. While we were waiting there, the original driver, the guard of the train now, he came running up, and he said that he has no vacuum in the brake van. Those were the days of vacuum brake trains. I said, what do you mean? I've got full vacuum in the locomotive. He says, but there's no vacuum at all in the brake van. Then we examined the train and we found that when the two rakes had been coupled together, the physical coupling was done, but the brake pipe, the train pipe had not been connected, which means we were running at only half the brake power on the train. And that is why there was no response to the braking that was taking place. Anyway, all well that ends well, nothing happened. No serious damage took place. And we were able to reach New Jalpaiguri without any difficulty. So these were the two experiences I had on the Territorial Army. I remained on the TA for another 10 years, but only attended camps and we were not embodied again. Camps were always interesting because you lived a complete army way of life. You were taught drill, you were taught how to use weapons, you went to regular army ranges to do actual firing. When I first joined the TA, we had the old 303 rifles, which were these board action rifles. And by the time I left, in fact, in the middle 70s itself, we had regular self-loading rifles. So, as officers, you normally carried, those 9mm ball ammunition guns, which fired rapidly, what you could refer to as 10 guns. We used those. So it was a very interesting experience, and at least I enjoyed it. I don't know about the rest. I will end here. If there are any questions or anybody would like to make any comments, you're welcome.
So what was your rank when you retired, Apurva?
I left as a major.
Okay.
If I had continued, I would have become Lieutenant Colonel, but I left as a major.
And did it affect your salary in any way? Did you get extras?
No, you got when you were on a camp, you got extra army salary also.
Okay.
But otherwise,
Yes, sir.
Otherwise, normally you got nothing extra. But when you were embodied, you got extra army salary.
Right.
And when you were embodied to help the railways, then the
Oh.
railways give you special allowances. So you got extra money then.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Morning, sir. Manoj, sir.
Hanji.
One small comment. Actually, the Territorial Army in the railways is limited only to the engineers and the traffic people. So when I came to the board, I tried to discuss with the TA people how the other people could also join, because today what we are having in the railways is many people are coming from the CRPF who have been assistant commandants or CISF and all that. They come for a better job in the railways as officers. So a proposal had been just started, then it died down, to let them join the railway the Territorial Army Environment Unit. There's something called it Environmental Territorial Army also, where people who are not technically, having a technical degree or operations people, they could also join. That way, maybe for a railway setup, it was not relevant. But for those who wanted to join the TA, that would have been quite interesting. But again, it died down like everything does.
There's one story I wouldn't mind telling right now. Driver Durga Shankar was awarded with the Veer Chakra. For the Indian Army, at the topmost guaranteed level, there are 3 medals: the Paramveer Chakra, the Mahavir Chakra, and a Veer Chakra. This has a very interesting link with the Rail Enthusiast Society also, which I will tell you about. See, after we got independence, it was decided that we should not continue the British Victoria Crosses and other such awards, but have our own award. And it was decided to design a Paramveer Chakra and a Mahavir Chakra and so on. The design was given to a lady whose name was Savitri Khanolkar. She was a Swiss lady born in Switzerland, but married to an Indian Army officer who finally retired as General Khanolkar. She married him, changed her name to Savitri. And since she was a designer and knew India well and knew Indian culture well, she was given the task of designing the Paramveer Chakra. She designed the Paramveer Chakra and the Mahavir and the Veer Chakra very soon after independence. The first war that took place in Pakistan was in 47-48. And the first recipient of the Paramveer Chakra was a Major Omnath Sharma. Interestingly, Savitri Khanolkar's daughter was married to who later became Lieutenant General S. N. Sharma. Somnath Sharma was the brother of S. N. Sharma, which means that the first Paramveer Chakra went to Savitri Khanolkar's daughter's brother-in-law. The treasurer of our society today, Abhimanyu Shonin, is the grandson of Savitri Khanolkar. So it's a very interesting connection between the Rail Enthusiast Society and the first Paramveer Chakra, which was awarded to Major Somnath Sharma.
Excellent. So what locos did you use in those days in Gamuna?
Valium 4. See, the
Diesels only.
Like I said, all Valium 4 diesels. And when we were in NF Railway, it was WDM2.
So this driver who got injured, he had injuries on his hands, is it?
Yeah. In fact, apparently it was a napalm bomb.
Okay.
So
he got burned. Okay.
But he completely but he used his elbows to run to work the throttle and so on.
Wow.
With the brake handles.
Okay.
So I think I'm told that the Veer Chakra was recommended by the armed forces, not by the TA unit.
Right.
The regular army recommended it.
All right. So have you visited Pakistan? You joined after that, yeah.
I joined after that.
Okay.
But since I was in that unit, I've heard all their stories.
Right. Okay.
There's another interesting story which Major NC Sinha had given me.
Yeah.
After the war was over, he was still in enemy territory.
Yes.
So one day, NC Sinha and another colleague of his decided to take a walk in the desert. Now it is very easy to get lost in the desert.
Yeah.
So on the way back, they lost track. Instead of coming to their own unit, they went towards one of the army units.
Yes.
So they were walking comfortably towards the unit. Then suddenly the guard there says, "Thumb, kona hai? Who's it?" Then they realized that they are not in their own unit. So they stopped. See, when you are in foreign territory, enemy territory, nobody's going to trust you.
Right.
So that guard at that unit says password. Now they hadn't learned the password. In any case, the password they knew was of their own unit, not of this unit. So they kept quiet. Very luckily for them, Sisina says that they heard that guard cocking his rifle, click, click. And he says that they actually didn't know what they had to do. They could do. Luckily, he didn't shoot, but he called his officer. Then they were able to explain and they got out of it. So when you are in foreign territory like this, in the war zone, you got to be very, very careful of these things.
So the Pakistani people returned the Indians?
No.
The Indian people?
Indian camp.
अपने लोग थे.
But then since you are in the war zone, you can't take things for granted. It could have been a Pakistani patrol or something.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. So 40 days they were in the Pakistani territory. They were till the
exact period was much longer than that. It was longer because they kept saying even as long as our troops remained in the forward areas.
Yes.
Trains were run. I think after a couple of months, this unit was brought back and another unit took its place to run the train.
Okay. Right.
But then, of course, the other unit didn't have to face hostility.
Yes. And you said there were 2 tracks that they were laid. Was it a double track section?
No, it was single line.
Okay.
What I mentioned was that when this track between Jodhpur and Hyderabad was made, the Jodhpur side, the Jodhpur to roughly the border was meter gauge, whereas the Pakistanis first built broad gauge.
Yes.
And later on to have continuity, but then it was one country, they converted it to meter gauge because they found the traffic was not sufficient for broad gauge.
Right.
And as the thing would have it, later on, both sides, Pakistan and India, converted this line to broad gauge.
Yeah.
And we had the Thar Express running between 2006 and 2019.
That's correct. Yes. Yeah.
And in fact, recently we had some. I beg your pardon?
This is Srinivas. I would like to speak for a minute.
Hanji.
Sir, it was a lovely talk, engrossing. And for my generation who have lived through 1971 war and 1974 strike, you have brought out very good stories which we were not knowing at all.
In fact, that was the intention of this talk, because even railwaymen, except those who have served in the TA, do not have much knowledge about the TA and what the TA has done.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for a lovely talk, sir.
My pleasure.
Fantastic.
Sorry. Are there any more questions or comments on the talk?
So this is a very big reason why diesel should be kept in operations. Because,
Appu, back to
Srini यार क्या है यार? जब कुछ emergency आएगी तो कहाँ बिजली लाओगे यार? चलो.
Another thing I would like to mention, there are 2, when you come out of Bombay, there are 2 ghats, one going towards Pune and one going towards Nasik. A lot has been written about the Pune Ghat, but very little is written about the Nasik Ghat. I think somehow we should cover that also.
Jail sir, you're absolutely right. The 3 cat sightings in that section are called TGR1, TGR2 and TGR3. Now TGR stands for Thal Ghat reversing, but visibly there is no reversing station.
No, there is no reversing.
But there is a reversing station because the last one has got a tunnel on the left hand side. If you're coming from Igatpuri to Mumbai side, there's a tunnel on the left hand side and the track goes into that tunnel, and the train would go inside the tunnel and then it will reverse and then turn back.
But there wasn't any reversing in that time. It must have been there.
No. It was at 1927, 1928.
Yeah, like the reversing line you had on the.
And on the Borghat also, yes. So Thalghat also had a reversing station, and we had planned of going there. We had done extensive research on the Google Earth and everything, but COVID came and then we got stuck. But abhi wo ho jayega. We will definitely do that. I agree with you that the way Borghat, every stone has been covered. Thalghat has got absolutely nothing.
Even the books that have been written by by anybody, they all talk about the building of the Borghat. Nobody talks about this other.
No, absolutely.
I'm sure it must have been as difficult.
Yeah, more difficult actually. It's remote. Yeah.
Sir, if I may add concerning the Northeast Ghat section a bit, if time permits, of course.
Please go ahead.
Yes, sir. There were another interesting thing about the Northeast Ghat section is that Kasara is at kilometer post 120 and Igatpuri is at kilometer post 136. So many people say if you look at the odometer in the locomotive, the reading will always give you 11 kilometers. So one might ask the question, what happened to the rest of the 4 kilometers that have been mentioned in the
In fact, the
chainage?
figure in my mind is also 11 kilometers.
Yes, absolutely. You're right, sir. And these 4 kilometers, they were the track leading from the existing alignment to these reversing stations. So
It was 4
net kilometer
kilometers.
is
Huh? It's
4
kilometers long.
kilometers.
Wow.
Yes, and not many people know about this. And the concerning a bit of electrical side, the substations in TGR2, they had they were fitted with inverters, means they could absorb the regenerative braking and they could feed it back to the grid. So I'm talking about the times when you were posted over there.
Okay, but that is DC to 3-phase AC, is it?
3-phase AC.
And back to that, whatever 130 kVA or whatever came into.
110 kV line used to run from the Chola powerhouse to these substations in the Northeast Ghat section.
Yeah. Okay. And these are mechanical inverters, obviously, rotary inverters.
No, they were fitted with the silicon controlled inverter switches at that time. The power supply and distribution rules book, the PDSR manual, the DC traction manual has a mention of this.
Okay. Right. If you can share those chapters, it will be very interesting reading.
I have
First
one
of
more
all,
point to add about these two ghat sections.
Yeah.
From the rail fans' viewpoint, Bhor Ghat is longer in length and more tunnels, more beautiful picturesque scenery as compared to Thal Ghat. That could be another reason why the rail fans also flock to Bhor Ghat and not to Thal Ghat.
Bhor Ghat is easier. And on the other side, now there is Pune. So Pune has got equally mad people. Mumbai has got some, but so many there. And on the other side, Igatpuri mein to koi hai hi nahi na.
Nasik mein hai,
Nasik
apna
mein
Nasik.
ek, only
I'm
one.
sure there are mad people at Nasik.
Only one. And
So incidentally, I studied in Nasik Road Central School, and then I went to REC Trichy, going through both Thal Ghat and Bhor Ghat to my college and back. That was my routine.
Yeah.
And I have done fantastic foot plating in those days in electric locos.
Right.
I did my schooling at the Bans High School at Devlali, which is not.
Oh, okay.
So, of course, at that time I didn't do any rail fanning, but you could see the trains coming from Igatpuri going towards Devlali from our school. You could see them sort of
Steam locos.
sneaking their way through that area.
Right.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much for a very nice talk. And I think somebody will propose a formal vote of thanks.
All right. Thanks, Jay, for a wonderful talk. It has really enlightened us about experiences on the Territorial Army. And I hope our friends who have attended today have found it interesting. So thank you all for joining today. And hopefully we'll have another interesting subject next month. Thanks, Jay, for everything.
Thank you, sir. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.